So my take, I mean, on this, I think, is that exactly as you said, the reason that there's this visa process and there are these terrible visa requirements in order to go into some of these developed countries is that there's been a number of Namibians that have gone to these countries and then not left. And the process is painful and it's expensive and so on. And I think that that's something that we should really be addressing with some of these counterparties to say, firstly, non-refundable visas, for a student or somebody that's trying, this is not very ethical. Things like the manner in which you're treated at the German embassy, this is not something that we agree with really. But the principle that, you have to, as a country, protect your borders, otherwise what are you? You're not a country if you don't have some kind of borders protection, I think is fairly well understood. And as you say, I don't think that Namibia has a major issue with people coming to Namibia and then overstaying their visas in a substantive sense time and time again and so on. So I think that that's the reason that these other countries have the visa on Namibia, and I don't think that Namibia needs to reciprocate on that issue. So it becomes more of an issue of sort of pride, and nobody likes to feel mistreated, obviously. That makes the blood boil, and you want to sort of get your revenge in some sense when people do that. But it's this hubris again that I mentioned that becomes kind of a bit suicidal. And what I think people don't always capture or comprehend on this visa issue is that there's a very basic economic principle, which is that if you increase prices, you reduce the volume demanded. This is not even first-year economics. This is high school economics. It's a very broad principle, and it's conceptually very easy to understand. If you double the price of beer, people will buy a bit less of it. But exactly how much a price increase reduces demand depends on the good or the service, and it depends on how price-sensitive people are and similar. But what we know for sure is that higher price is lower volume demanded. What we don't know for sure in this instance is how much, say, a 3 or 5% increase in the cost of your trip, and not just the cost, but also the admin of getting these visas. I mean, we have an event next week in which we have to get visas for some of the speakers, and the process is, quite alarming. It's being handled as efficiently as a bad process can be handled, I would say, but it's still not a good process. So in this instance, we submit a bunch of documents to NIPDB, NIPDB submits something to Home Affairs returns it to NIPDB, we have to go to Home Affairs to physically pay for these visas, it then gets kicked back to, we then have to take the original receipt to NIPDB somehow submits that to Home Affairs, and ultimately we hopefully get visas. This is not a no friction process. But so we don't know exactly how many people will look at a higher price, say a 5% higher price, to come to Namibia and say, well, then I'll rather go to South Africa, or I'll rather go to Kenya, or I'll rather go to Spain, or whatever it is. But we do know that there will likely be some reduction. And we've been speaking to the embassies and the airlines the last couple of days to try to figure out if we can quantify it. What we know for sure is that there is already a reduction. What we don't know is exactly how big it is. But people being denied boarding in Frankfurt, for example, people not being able to submit all of their documentation, on time and so on, and then people just going, we don't want to arrive in a country without a visa and have to figure it out there with a risk that we get returned and so on. So we'd rather go somewhere else. So we know that there is an impact. We're just not sure how big. But the point that we like to make around this is, with a very high multiplier industry, which is what our tourism industry is. So if you bring 100 US of foreign currency into Namibia and you spend it at the lodges and you spend it at the craft shops and in the restaurants and so on, it's a high multiplier industry because it's cash that's paid into rural communities predominantly and into employment, into salaries. So the tourism industry is the single largest employing sector after government in the country. So between 50 and 80,000 people have income from the tourism industry. And so if you take that $100 that was spent away, you're actually taking something like $800 out of the economy because of how it multiplies. And so what this means is that you're basically playing with sort of live ammunition when it comes to doing things that may be detrimental to the tourism industry. And so we've done some calculations on this, and it basically works out that a 0.38% reduction in tourism from these affected countries will leave the country in a net negative position. It'll mean that there's a bit more revenue for government directly, but probably less revenue for government indirectly, so tax revenue and similar, and revenue from employment. And obviously then, less income at household level, less income for your tourism companies, for your employees of tourism, and similar. So this is the point, that because we have this high multiplier industry, a small reduction in the utilization of that industry has this big ripple effect. And so we should be very careful when it comes to this. Now, at the same time, obviously a low friction visa is much better than a high friction visa and so on. But the reality is that Namibia needs as many foreign dollars as possible. We're not a very wealthy country domestically, and the more that we can attract foreign economic activity, the better it is for us as a people, for the country. And when we sit with these very high levels of unemployment, I'm told I talk about employment too much and that's my excuse for everything and so on. But in reality, that is the single most important thing for Namibia. We need to get employment up so that we get household incomes up, so that we get sanitation to improve, etc., etc. The employment is very much at the center of everything. And we need to do whatever we can to increase the number of Namibians that are employed, and this will also have these multiplier effects. It will be good for government revenues, it will be good for demands on the public purse dropping. So if people have household incomes from employment, they don't need as much support from the state and similar. Yeah. So employment is very much at the core of everything. And getting policy right that increases employment in the country should very much be our focus. The half a dozen, or I'm being hyperbolic, but the very small number of Namibians that travel abroad every year, the 10,000 or 20,000 Namibians that leave the country every year, they are absolutely insignificant in terms of the tourism statistics elsewhere. And the spending power of the Namibian tourist on average is also quite low compared to the spending power of the foreign tourist. The countries that the Namibian tourists go to, if it's the US, if it's the UK, if it's mainland Europe, these are countries that have close to full employment, or structurally full employment. And so these are really just not like-for-like comparisons. So this is very much an emotive argument. I was mistreated, and these bloody foreigners, they are so rude to us, and they're so unappreciative, and we should get kind of revenge. But it's revenge that's more detrimental than beneficial to us. And so, as much as I understand the emotion around it, it's not useful emotion. It's actually destructive emotion.
Yeah.